It's a real pleasure to have Scott here, and Scott is he's a professor at Chicago Booth, and the first, I guess, of what's going to be a sequence of I guess outside speakers as such. I think he's going to talk about his job market paper, which actually follows on pretty nicely from the paper I presented, because it, in many ways it looks at the same regulation. One thing that I want to point out, and that you'll obviously notice when you see his paper and his presentation, that the style of data work is very different, in particular in the second half of his paper. So while the paper that I presented is primarily a reduced form piece of analysis, I think what Scott is doing is sort of introducing a lot more structure. So you'll see sort of the differences there. It introduces complexity, but it buys you the ability to do welfare analysis. And so I think we'll see that, and I'm looking forward. And thanks, Scott, for taking the time to to talk to all of us about your research.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for the chance to be here, Teresa and Johannes. It's a real honor to be on the syllabus. And for every PhD student in the room, or soon to be PhD student, I was in your shoes very recently. And so when I present this, I'll give you a mix of how I would usually present it and kind of some behind the scenes details of what it was like working on the paper as a job market paper. I'll share my screen and see if Johannes or Teresa let me know that come through all right.
Perfect.
Great. So I like to start off talking about this project by pointing out two things: that the US credit card market is an important source of credit for many US households. So among actively used credit card accounts, about 70% are used for borrowing at least 3 months of the year, where by borrowing we mean you don't fully pay back the credit card at the end of the month. You're clearly using the card to smooth through some mismatch between expenses and income. The credit card market is also the setting of interesting recent price regulation. So similar to Johannes, Johannes and co-authors, I studied the 2009 Credit Card Act. I focus on how the Act, one of its main planks, which restricted credit card banks from discretionarily raising a borrower's interest rate over time. So of course, if you cannot adjust rates over time, then pricing cannot respond to new information that is learned through lending relationships. And this project very broadly asks, how does the credit card market respond to such informational pricing restrictions? I think it's helpful to show just a picture of what changes when the Act takes effect vis-a-vis repricing. So what I've shown in this plot is for each month on the x-axis, the share on the y-axis of credit card accounts that at some point in the next year experience a discretionary upward increase in their interest rate. So you see in that top gold-colored line that prior to the Card Act, roughly 50% of accounts experience such an interest rate increase at some point over a year, whereas after the Act, that drops close to zero. So we might ask, what kind of information do we think is getting priced when lenders are increasing prices this way? One type of information could be information about risk. So we think there will be potentially unpriced risk information ex post after the Card Act takes effect. This implies we might think that the pool of borrowers could become riskier over time. So this is just downward sloping demand. You're no longer raising prices to the risky borrowers. So with downward sloping demand, that pool will shift towards those risky borrowers. This means that lenders may need to compensate themselves ex ante for this change in the risk pool ex post. That increase in prices ex ante could set off something like an Akerlof style unraveling in the market, where now the next safest tier of borrowers look at the price of the new credit card account and say, I don't want any part of that. So they leave, the remaining pool is even riskier, prices go up even more. You kind of have this market unraveling effect. But risk isn't the only information that might get priced. There could also be information about demand in the market that lenders learn about borrowers over time. As that becomes unpriced, we might see that lenders in particular are not raising rates on, say, price inelastic borrowers, borrowers who are revealed to be the type you want to just charge a higher rate to because they're willing to pay it. And so we may see lower markups. So we could think of the effects of the Act as this tug of war between adverse selection, or that Akerlof style unraveling, and market power. And what I do in this project is I ask, how do these two forces trade off to determine the overall effect of the Card Act in equilibrium. So do some market segments or credit score groups benefit? Do some unravel a la Akerlof? Net of all that, how does consumer and total surplus change? And can CARD Act-like informational restrictions more generally potentially improve market efficiency? So here's, as some background on this project, this was a project that really came question first. I remember as third year of graduate school, I'm just back from the AEA conference and I'm supposed to be skiing. And I've sort of, after the conference, I've gotten this question in my head that I want to think about the CARD Act, and here's how I think the CARD Act might work. And I, at this point, no data, no idea how to identify anything. I just sort of had this question. So I come back, I talk to my advisor, Jim Paterba, and I say, so I want to study this, but I think it's really hard and I have no idea how to do it. And he said, sounds like a great question, stick at it. And through all the challenges of graduate school where I said, Jim, this just isn't working, he said, stick at it, this is a good question. Stick at it, this is a good question. And so different projects have different seeds that kind of germinate and become the project. But for me, this was sort of, here was the question, and we just had to sit down to try to figure out how to answer it. So what I end up doing is I present two broad types of evidence on the effects of the CARD Act. I have some reduced form evidence where I just highlight that these two forces I've highlighted on the prior slides play a crucial role, central role in the market. So on the adverse selection front, I show that after the CARD Act, changes in credit score become nearly unpriced. So there's something I'll call adverse retention on existing accounts. You can't sort of push risky borrowers away as much. And there's suggestive evidence that there's some unraveling at the time of origination, a la Akerlof. I also, on the market power front, point out, this is just an existence result. I point out that there are many privately observed signals of demand characteristics that contribute to price dispersion and markups in the market. And after the CARD Act, I show that that price dispersion falls and those markups fall. I then build a structural model of the market to think about the interplay of these two forces. I take a strategy where I estimate this model on the pre-CARD Act equilibrium. To do this, I use data from a near universe of US credit card accounts. I exploit quasi-experimental price variation that I sort of go and uncover in those data in order to recover borrowers' private types and the dynamics of those types. And then finally, I implement the CARD Act price restrictions in the model, and I study how the equilibrium of the model responds. So this is a particular ceteris paribus sense of studying the CARD Act's effects. It's controlling for keeping the entire pre-CARD Act environment constant and just changing one thing, which is this particular way of regulating price changes over time. The key result is I find in this model that consumer surplus rises and average transacted prices fall throughout the market. And interestingly, total surplus rises in the prime market. And in this sense, I find that market power is a more important force than adverse selection in determining the effects of the CARD Act ex post. I also highlight that insurance value is key for that gain in the prime market. And this is actually something that wasn't on that prior slide, wasn't there on that ski vacation. I was sort of sitting, thinking about the CARD Act. This kind of just came out of the data and said, okay, cool, this is something neat to understand about the CARD Act. How's this paper situated? As you learned earlier today, of course, there's Johannes and co-authors seminal work on the CARD Act earlier. I sat down and said, gosh, this is going to be challenging because there's already been a great paper written about the CARD Act. In many ways, this paper is motivated by wanting to say, so these remarkable results of the CARD Act causing a price decrease, how do the fundamentals of the market help explain how that could have happened? How is it we remove information in the market and despite it being an adversely selected market, have prices fall? I also want to ask, what do we think of the welfare implications of the policy? How are there distributional issues across different types of borrowers, some who might be pushed out of the market as a result of this? This is also somewhat inspired by Ben Keyes and co-authors' work. Where I remember I was at the CFPB at this time, and Ben came to the CFPB, and we were talking about the CARD Act. And Ben had this neat result that there's evidence from direct mail credit card offers that there's potentially some unraveling in the subprime credit card market after the CARD Act. I wanted to kind of think about how could some of the evidence that we see in direct mail be explained by fundamentals of what might drive adverse selection in the market. Of course, there was research on credit cards before the CARD Act. So there's a long literature on imperfect competition in the credit card market, understanding demand and usage of credit cards. Teresa's paper presented just recently as part of that long line of work. And also broader topics beyond credit cards or even consumer finance, thinking about adverse selection in selection markets and how we regulate information in selection markets when we're not going to be able to escape those information asymmetries. Johannes's co-author, Neil Mahoney, of course, has this paper with Glenn Weil that I think was a huge inspiration for this project, because they have this very clean decomposition of how you can think of the world as having demand types and risk types. And if you can kind of pin down the joint distribution of those types, you can understand a lot about adverse selection. Great. So I want to give a preview of where the paper ultimately goes. At the very end of the structural estimation, what I'll have recovered is along these x-axis, you'll see private information types. These are types that are not observable to a lender when you start lending to a consumer, but we think the lender might learn over time through a lending relationship. The key thing to know about these private information types now is that they're increasing in the borrower's risk. So the higher number are the riskier borrowers. So what I estimate is in the pre-card act equilibrium within one credit score. So this plot is just for a particular credit score bin of 680, right down the middle of the credit score distribution. For that particular credit score bin, I estimate that these different private information types are totally separated by the pre-card act pricing schedule. So you see that the very riskiest types pays the highest price, the safest types pays the lowest price. And that turns into, because we think these higher types have some higher demand, that there's actually kind of a very mixed picture of the high types borrow at say 40 or 50% share, the low types borrow at sort of a little under 40% share, but kind of everyone participates in the market to some degree. I find after the Card Act, there's this shift towards much more pooled pricing. That's this dotted red line. This is what the model predicts. And then there's some evidence that this also sort of matches what we see in the market in actuality after the act. So with this more pooled pricing, many borrowers are paying a lower price. And you see correspondingly their borrowing increases in this right panel. But these very safest borrowers are actually paying a higher price and they borrow less. And so that's the sense in which we see partial unraveling in the market. But this is just one credit score bin. And there are bins where it looks worse and bins where it looks better. So we'll get to that and we'll sort of understand the sort of full mosaic, hopefully, of the welfare effects once we get there. So that's where we're going. I'm going to go way back and just do some sort of lay some groundwork with some background on the act and some reduced form evidence first. So very briefly as background on the act, because I know you've already learned about this earlier today, the part of the act that I want to focus on is that the act substantially restricted lenders' ability to change pricing in response to new information. So there are many dimensions of credit card pricing, but a key dimension is APR, and effectively there were no interest rate or APR increases allowed on existing debt after the Card Act. Many behavior contingent fees were also eliminated or capped, and so this will limit lenders' ability to change pricing dynamically in response to behavior. The Card Act, of course, included many other mandates, but at the time of the act, both industry and regulators tended to agree that this was, here I have the American Bankers Association, the quote, core most important provision of the Card Act was these restrictions on pricing. That's what I want to focus on here. One other thing I want to highlight is that these restrictions really restricted the pricing of two types of information. I'll divide this information into public information we can think of as what's in the credit report, and we'll take that to be summarized by someone's FICO score, and then private information, which is kind of soft information that's acquired over time through a lending relationship. So I have some reduced form evidence on how the Credit Card Act changed the pricing of different types of information. First, I consider how it may have changed the pricing of risk. I show that the Card Act decoupled pricing from risk, in particular using changes in FICO to identify changes in risk over time. And I show suggestive evidence that this contributes to the borrower pool becoming riskier over time and contributes to partial market unraveling a la Akerlof at the time of origination. I'll develop those reduced form results a bit here. I won't have time to go into some of the other reduced form results. In those other results, I show that there's other information that also becomes unpriced after the act, in particular information related to borrower demand. I show that there are privately observed signals that lenders observe in the pre-Card Act regime and then respond to in pricing in such a way that after observing that signal, the lender makes more money on that account. A key example of this is when a borrower pays not late by say 60 days or something that really sounds scary for the lender, but late by like 1 hour or 1 day. This actually reveals for some credit, for some FICO segments that borrower is just sort of busy, distracted, behavioral something, and therefore going to be less responsive to price changes. And in fact, lenders know this enough to increase prices on those consumers, and it translates into returns of 300 up to 300 basis points more on those accounts per year in response to those signals. However, after the act, I show that these excess returns on those inelastic borrowers are reduced or reversed. I also show that as a kind of net effect of these two changes in pricing, that mature account price dispersion fell sharply, conditional on right after the act takes effect. So this is sort of very neat plot. I'll click through to this just to show this real quick, where before the act, we see this level of kind of 700 to 800 basis points in price dispersion, and it drops to 500 immediately when the act takes effect on those sort of mature accounts that are no longer going to allow this kind of price change as the account matures and the lender learns about the borrower. So I'll show you just some of these reduced form results. I study how the Card Act restricts the pricing of changes in FICO score. I put on the right-hand side of a regression changes in FICO score since origination. I control for FICO score origination, the age of the account, and I'll call this sort of the gradient of pricing with respect to emergent risk. And then I'll compare that to the gradient of pricing with respect to origination risk, just the risk available at the time the account is originated. And I'll compare these two gradients before and after the act. So in the pre-Card Act period, I find that these two gradients are essentially the same. These axes are scaled in such a way that the slope tells you how much a borrower has to pay per point of FICO score risk, whether that FICO score risk is observable at origination on the bottom x-axis or revealed after origination on the upper x-axis. I compare that slope with what we see in post-Card Act data. Post-Card Act data, we see that the slope of pricing with respect to emergent risk is substantially flattened. And so this is a very reduced form sense in which the pricing of risk that is learned after origination becomes much more attenuated after the Card Act limits those price changes. We might be interested in how this changing of the pricing of risk might change the borrower pool. I ask, putting the same terms on the right-hand side that we had in the earlier relationship between pricing and emergent risk, I now, with those same terms on the right-hand side, put attrition on the left-hand side. So do borrowers become more or less likely to attrit from borrowing as a function of their change in FICO score after sort of those changes in FICO score, if you will, become a little more insured? Pricing responds to them less. I find suggestive evidence that's indeed the case, that consumers who have their FICO score increase, so they become safer after origination, they become more likely to attrit after the Card Act, whereas safer borrowers who become riskier become less likely to attrit after the Card Act. The lenders sort of stuck with the riskier borrowers where they're losing the safer borrowers. So taking stock of the reduced form evidence, I then pivot in the middle of the paper to say, look, we could potentially use a structural model to understand the interaction of all these forces in equilibrium. We've got different pricing of risk, different pricing of demand characteristics. That'll change how borrowers are pooled, how they select into borrowing, who exits the market. We can ask, how do these two forces kind of balance out in equilibrium? So I'll now do some work to develop that model and then show you how I estimate it and what it gets us. So at the core of the model is a bunch of borrowers making discrete choices over different credit card products. They have card issuers indexed by J, and for whatever credit card or issuer they pick, they're going to choose to either borrow on that card or transact on that card, which just means you pay it off at the end of every month. Or also they could just take an outside good, which is no credit card at all. Demand for these different choices will be determined by a finite mixture of consumer types theta. These types will just drive consumers' tastes for these different choices. You'll get, for example, as type theta, flow utility D sub theta J when you borrow from bank J. And you incur disutility gamma sub theta P sub theta J when you borrow at price P sub theta J from bank J. There will be a number of other factors that affect demand. So consumers will face adjustment costs across different cards, adjustment costs when they move from borrowing to transacting. But a key flexible thing I want to highlight in this setup is that there's flexible correlation between demand characteristics and risk. So each of these types theta will default at some rate delta. When you default, you move to the outside good. And then these types evolve as is standard in the dynamic discrete choice literature under a Markov transition matrix that I'll denote T. These types are a key part of the model. I collapse consumer heterogeneity into two dimensions of that type theta. As I kind of foreshadowed when I talked about two types of information in the market, there's going to be a public type X and a private type psi. I make two key assumptions on these types, and these assumptions drive a lot of the estimation in the empirical part of the model. First, without loss of generality, just let private information types be ordered so that higher types are the higher risk types. So when you control for X, if your psi is higher, you're higher risk. You default more. These two assumptions I mentioned are first what I'll call price invariance of default. Those types theta determine your default invariantly to whatever your price is. And I have some evidence for this, and that both comes from other randomized controlled trials that have been done, and also some variation I have in the paper. I also assume that there's what I'll call non-advantageous selection, or this is basically an adverse selection condition. So low-risk types are sufficiently inelastic that lenders will want to price them higher than high-risk types. You can make a sort of sufficient condition for this just in terms of probabilities of continuing to borrow, and there's RCT evidence consistent with this, this assumption holding in the credit card market. Then what consumers do in terms of making these choices is they trade off an immediate benefit in terms of their flow utility with an expected continuation value. I'll jump over this because I think it's either, if you're sort of in the IO literature, you'll say, oh yeah, this is very standard. If you're not, you'll find this not very interesting, but I'll sort of refer you to the paper for details on how this works. But that dynamic trade-off is one thing I want to highlight that the borrowers are certainly doing. There's a bunch of different parameters on the demand side of the model that drive these choices. So consumers will be choosing whether they borrow or they don't borrow. They'll be choosing between bank J and some other bank J prime or another bank J double prime. And when they switch from, say, borrowing to not borrowing, they'll incur some liquidity cost, L. When they switch from bank J to some new bank J prime, they'll incur some switching cost, S. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't say this while the paper is still under revision, but if I had to do this over again as a PhD student, I would have made this simpler. I wanted to go into it as saying, well, who knows what drives demand in the credit card market? I want to keep it really flexible, but I sort of pay the cost for this in the amount of time it takes to estimate the model later on, which limits some things you can do with the model. One slide on what's going on the supply side of the model. I make two key informational assumptions. I say that firms, will observe mature consumers full type. So this is a very stylized version of a learning model where once you've lent to a consumer for one period, you know both of their types, both that public and that private dimension. But you only see the public type or your FICO score at the time of origination. And then consistent with institutional details in the market, lenders will post a mature account price and a teaser price for new accounts for each FICO score, for each privately observed type, each period. And then firm flow payoffs are simple, it's just price minus cost. So that's the setup. How do we go about estimating this? I have three key steps. The first of these is kind of one of my personal favorite things in the paper. This took a long time to get it to work, and I just sort of, I think it's quite neat. What I do is I use those two assumptions I made on types to argue that these observed prices are going to be invertible for the types that only the inside lender, the lender who's been borrowing to a consumer or lending to a consumer for a while, will see. Using that invertibility, I make a bunch of plots like this. What I have here is just raw data showing for two banks and one FICO score segment, how they price to different types of consumers, and what that consumer's ex post default rate is. I want this to be invertible, so I'll use isotonic regression to get truly monotone fits here. When you run that isotonic regression, you see just how close to monotone these relationships are. And then the setup of the model and those two main assumptions I highlighted imply that the ex post default rate reveals what those ex ante unobserved types are. And so I can just, to make this tractable, discretize those ex post default rates into any number of types I want to. I've done 10, I've done 5, I've done 3, the sort of baseline results in the paper are with 5 types. And so you can read off a consumer's ex post default rate and their pricing what type they are. You do this FICO score by FICO score, lender by lender in the model to recover those private types. I then exploit one of the first things, I'm gonna skip this slide for time. I then exploit one of the first things I see in the data when I started sort of playing with the data at the CFPB. I noticed that there are these occasional idiosyncratic portfolio-wide repricing events by certain lenders. Basically, that means the lender takes their entire book and reprices everyone by, let's say, 100 basis points at once. I talked to people who are kind of in the credit card industry and said, yeah, it's plausible lenders are doing this. It could be something just the portfolio manager thought to do. It could be a directive from upper management. And I focused on one of these events where I was able to link it to an upcoming merger or acquisition by one bank, where from investor relations materials for that bank, I was able to see that the bank just sort of sent out this directive that we're going to just try to shrink the size of our loan book in anticipation of kind of a change in the internal cost of capital for this merger acquisition upcoming. So what this bank does is I've plotted in red the 10 deciles of that bank's credit card price distribution across its entire book. You see at event time 0, they bump up their entire price distribution. Meanwhile, other banks shown in this dotted line aren't doing anything special at all. And in the post period, Bank A, this bank with the variation, keeps playing that new strategy while other banks don't respond. So I use this in exactly what you'd expect, a difference in differences strategy across borrowers on different banks, exploiting the types that I've already recovered to estimate a type-specific sensitivity to price for each consumer. You can do that in IV. I just sort of have a quick table where I estimate sort of one generic parameter across all types to show how just how that differs from the OLS estimates. But a nice thing I like to do also is show how those estimates differ across public types FICO. In the demand model, I've specified those price coefficients that I'm recovering through this regression are actually a consumer's marginal utility of income. And since we know lower FICO consumers also tend to be poorer, it's a really nice validation of this estimation, I think, that we see that lower FICO score consumers indeed have higher marginal utilities of income, as we'd expect. So the final steps in model estimation is just matching some moments to recover other demand parameters and then using firm first order conditions to recover costs. What I finally do with the model is I implement the CARD Act restrictions in the model to study the policy's effects. I introduce a new regime where lenders' mature account pricing, this P1J here, can now only depend on the FICO score observed at origination. So they can no longer change pricing as your type changes or as they learn more about your private type over time. Teaser rates, I think this is important to include because this was still allowed under the CARD Act, are still allowed. So I have sort of 2 price vectors for each firm that I'll need to solve for in this equilibrium. This unleashes the 2 key forces I've highlighted before. And after the model converges, we can study where the new equilibrium sits. And now we're back to that plot that I promised you at the beginning. And we have hopefully some more tools under our belt to understand what it is. I've shown you how these private information types recover the unobserved component of risk that lenders may learn through the course of a lending relationship. And I show that for this, again, these FICO 680 consumers that I showed you at the start of the talk, they move to almost nearly completely pooled pricing in the post-CARD Act period. While this particular segment of the market doesn't unravel very much, at lower FICO scores, there's more unraveling. So we see that for deep subprime consumers with, say, a FICO score of 580, the bottom 3 to 4 of these 5 private information types now face higher prices as the market has unraveled. And you can actually, as the model converges in equilibrium, you can watch this in MATLAB where sort of lenders will charge a price of 30 and some consumers exit. And then they charge a price of 40 and some consumers exit. And this dotted red line shows you where the model finally converges. Correspondingly, the right-hand side plot, you see that those borrowers facing higher pricing now do less borrowing. The model also lets us think about, I'm gonna skip this slide on pricing, but the model also lets us think about welfare. So we can ask, how do consumers lose or benefit from this change in pricing? The striking thing I find is that consumer surplus roughly doubles conditional and FICO across the board, whether you're subprime or super prime. In contrast, though, total surplus is a bit more of a mixed bag. Lender profits actually fall at the bottom of the FICO score distribution, but rise at the top of the distribution so that total surplus actually rises for those super prime consumers. This was a surprising enough finding that I felt the need to explore this a little more in kind of the final set of work I did on the paper. And what I did, at least to date, there's still more to come, of course, as I go through the revision. But the final thing I wanted to explore was, so what is it that is driving that great increase in surplus for the super prime group? I said, let's try to ask whether it's driven by the insurance value of the CARD Act. You are a super prime consumer, you get to lock in good pricing at your good credit score, and then when your credit score falls over time, you can retain that good pricing, and that has good insurance value because similar when we saw those price coefficients across FICO scores, your marginal utility of income is higher in that low FICO score state, and you can sort of, this is classic insurance where transferring dollars to high marginal utility states of the world. So in order to kind of capture what the insurance effect is, I create a counterfactual. I look at, let's say there's no insurance value from the act because types are not going to change. And then I ask, how much do the gains from the act vary across different consumer credit score types? I find that for super prime, those highest credit score consumers, when there's no insurance value, they barely gain from the act. Their surplus gain is only 16%. Whereas in the baseline case, consumer surplus more than doubles. And this highlights the importance of the insurance value of the act for explaining where we see some of these surplus gains coming from. All right, so I think I'm at time. I'll just wrap up in a couple bullet points here. I studied this really important recent price regulation in a credit market, the credit card market that matters for a lot of American consumers. I find that there's partial unraveling from unpriced risk in the market, but both through some reduced form evidence and then through the structural model, I argue that markups and market power are actually the dominant force in driving what explains the Card Act's sort of benefits to consumers across the board. I find that consumer and total surplus both rise. Then I argue in the paper that there actually may be lessons here that are relevant for other settings beyond just consumer credit or the credit card market. For example, when we think about the Affordable Care Act and the famous Handel-Winston paper on that, looking at market unraveling after removing of pricing in that market, I think about, well, maybe market power is an important thing to study in other contexts too, to help understand why I find that the market doesn't unravel as much here as Handel-Winston finds it does after the ACA in the health insurance context. Great. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you at the happy hour this evening.
Thank you, Scott. This was really great. So just two things, I guess, that I want to kind of add to this work. So I think the first is that I first saw actually Scott present this paper not in a 30-minute talk but in a 20-minute talk, and even then he managed to kind of get the main intuitions across in a short period of time for a paper that's really extremely rich. So I think this is a paper where there's a lot going on, so I would encourage you all to actually go and read the paper. There's much more in it even than what Scott covered in this period of time. I think the other thing that to me is interesting is just sort of and I think something that's sort of interest maybe to PhD students also is just the sequencing of how our understanding, say, of this specific piece of regulation develops over time. So so this initial work that I presented earlier on kind of showed some of the aggregate price movements, but didn't go as much into the details of of what was really behind it and what were sort of some of the implications for banks' abilities to adjust risk pricing. So we thought about these fees, primarily as just an overall element of the cost, but we didn't think of them quite as much about these sort of state-dependent costs that would allow banks to price discriminate across consumers with different characteristics, different risk profiles, different demand elasticities, and so on. And in order to do that, a lot of the structure that this paper here brings to the table, I think is very valuable. So thanks a lot, Scott. It'll be good to have you back at 5. I think I want to ask you a little bit about how you work with this data, and also want to speak to you then a little bit about sort of your insights and your advice to other graduate students who are thinking about this more structural work versus the more reduced form. So we'll come back to that at 5. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you in a bit.